Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to the second channel video. Yesterday was a huge election night in England. We had the local elections, we had mayoral races across the country, but we also had the first national election defeat for Keir Starmer since becoming Prime Minister, and he lost it not to the traditional opposition party, the Conservatives, but instead to the more populist Reform Party. Their leader, Nigel Farage, claims this is a big moment taking place in politics, and I think it's very fair to say he's right. I mean, if we look at this election and the results from 2024, you can see that, yeah, it was a wipe for the Labour Party. They had a 15,000 vote majority, one of the safest in the country, but despite that, it's gone from a 15,000 majority to a 6 vote majority for the Reform Party. Yes, literally 6 votes, one of the narrowest in history, by the way, as you can see right here, and this is still going to be a win for Reform, and it's going to be a win for Reform that really changes the UK political system, because if these keep happening, if the tidal wave keeps growing, it's going to be something that other parties have to react to, and let's talk about how that's going to change and who else has won from these elections, because interestingly, this should be a win for Reform at the expense of Labour, and on the basic maths it is. Reform has gone from having 5 or 6 MPs to having an additional one now. Obviously they have got that partially suspended MP right, but they've arguably got an extra MP now, and that's come at the cost of Labour, but the weird thing is Labour didn't really lose it because they have such a huge majority, and also they suspended the guy before anyway because there was a video of him punching a man to the ground. A fun story as to why they held the by-election. But yeah, what's really interesting about this is a loss for the Labour Party, but both the Conservatives and the Reform see this as a bigger loss for them. Because if we look at this, you can see that, yeah, Mr. Farage declared the Conservatives are toast, and in much of this country, if you vote Conservative, you'll get Labour. If you've ever lived in a two-party system, you know how people say stuff like that, like, oh, if you vote for smaller parties, it means you get insert big party you don't like here. But in fact, they are now starting to use that line against the Conservatives, saying we are now the opposition party in the United Kingdom to the Labour Party, and the Tories, frankly, are a waste of space. And that's kind of interesting, but if you look at these election results, you can see how if some people, if some people who wouldn't really want to vote for Reform, but voted for them because they were winning, instead stuck to their principles, their quotes, and voted for the Conservative Party, if literally 7 people had done that, then the Reform Party wouldn't have won, and neither would the Conservatives, instead the Labour Party would. That is the argument of vote Conservative, get Labour, and it actually is happening in much of the north of England, and I think that's hugely interesting. But also interesting is the Conservative response, where they say that, yeah, it was a bad night for us, but it was a terrible night for the Labour Party. It was the Labour Party who did poorly because of their terrible policies, and saying that their Reform Party were doing well, but they're emerging as a populist party, not an alternative to us, but instead they're trying to transcend and promise everything to everybody, which is not a long-term sustainable position. This is a really interesting quote here saying that, yeah, they are doing well for now, but we don't think they're going to be doing well for long, and it is something which we can kind of look into the history of and see more of. But first things first, let's look at the rest of the election results. This is the current council results so far. There are 23 councils up for grabs. If you want to, in England, we have obviously mostly, I guess what you could describe as nationalised government. We have most of our government being done not here in Ottawa, thankfully, but instead, most of our government is done from London across the UK. If you live in Wales or Scotland, some of your government is done from your respective parliament. But what's interesting is that there are lots of decisions made by the local government bodies, and these are the councils that are up for grabs. And most people don't really care about these too much, but they probably should. It's a lot of very important decisions being done with your council tax. But in either case, these are the seats up for grabs, and right now the Reform Party is winning the majority that have come up. This is something that takes a few days to properly come out. The actual full picture will take a few days there, but what we have seen overnight is the mayoral races, where, as you can see, the Reform Party have not just won a single seat in a single area of heavily Labour country, they instead have won the mayoralty in Greater Lincolnshire, which is the biggest geographic area to have a mayor, right? I mean, look at the size of this place. And they won it not like by a little bit, by 6 votes. They won it by, we're talking about tens of thousands, 42% of the vote to the Conservatives, 26. As you can see, this is, by the way, a huge right-wing takeover of Lincolnshire to have first and then second and then for third place to be that far out. But you can see that this is a huge win for Reform, and they're also probably looking at their losses as being pretty decent too. The west of England, which is one of the most left-leaning parts of the UK, has a Labour Party win, but then the Reform Party's here in second, with the Green Party in third, and the Conservatives sitting in fourth, sitting below not just their natural opposition party, but sitting below the Green Party. Pretty rough for them, and indeed, even though I'm sure the Labour Party would have preferred to have won by more, the fact that they won anyway, pretty impressive. If we look at the If we look at Doncaster over here, you can see that it's a similar situation, winning by a very small, margin. You can see here it's literally hundreds of votes to the Reform Party because the right-wing vote was clearly larger as a whole, but it split almost perfectly to allow the to allow the Labour Party to win it again. And indeed, you can kind of see that that's the common theme across each of these mayor elections. I think North Tyneside is a little bit further out, but not really by much. It is the right-wing vote is splitting almost perfectly, which is what allows the Labour Party to get in, which is actually what happened at our last election too. The last election had a far higher right-wing vote than left-wing vote, but the left-wing vote was perfectly formed into the Labour Party, and so good job to them for that. But this is something that doesn't happen on the council-wide level, which is why you can see that there is a huge right-wing surge there, which is really, really, really interesting, right? So what, again, I think if you are the Reform Party, you want to say, no, there's no such thing as populism, conservative or not. There are people who believe that, to put things simple, there are people who believe that higher taxes and illegal immigration are bad, and that people are fed up with them, right? There's a sense of fairness and what's right and wrong, bordering on resentment. You can just say like, oh yeah, people are voting for us because we have the correct policies, people like us as a party, and we've got things going right. But I would actually say, especially at the local elections, this becomes very clear that people are voting partially based on the local candidates. I think you should do it entirely based on your local candidates. I would vote for my local, my Green, Independent, Lib Dem, Labour, Conservative, Reform if I believed genuinely they were going to do what's right for my area, even if I hated their nationwide politics, right? But what's interesting is the fact that, a lot of people do use it as kind of a protest vote in some places. So depending on where you live, you can see that there's going to be a huge shift happening here. And this shift is likely going to be against the Conservatives. They had control of almost all of these councils before because they last brought for election when they were doing pretty strong. And they're going to lose a bunch of them now to the Reform Party. And this is going to happen in every election going forwards, I would imagine. And I think the simplest analysis here is from John Curtis. You might recognize him from the actual live election nights, but he put something kind of simple here, which is the idea that the party won 39% of the results in the mayoral election. One of the reasons is because this has Lincolnshire and Staffordshire, both of which had voted heavily for Brexit in 2016, and it's the first time an anti-EU party has won a by-election afresh. Previously, the UKIP had won elections, but it was Conservative MPs standing down and running as UKIP. Basically, we have a new right wing that is significantly more popular than the old right wing in decent parts of the country, and this is something that will intensify the debate about how the Conservatives should respond, because sure, the Lib Dems are doing pretty well. I think they're happy with their night tonight. I think they're usually pretty happy with local elections, but the real story here is the Conservatives and the Reform are occupying a very similar space on the political spectrum, and every time they are allowing the Labour Party to win. The Labour Party got, again, just a reminder, only about a third of the votes at the last election, but because their opposition was so split, things went kind of poorly. And this is something that is, again, it's really interesting that the situation for the Labour Party is they don't actually, despite losing a bunch of seats as the government, this should be their moment where they're like, oh, do we have to respond to that? Actually, not really. Also, by the way, most of the hopes the Liberal elections and Greens have for these results are concentrated coming later today, and it does suggest that they're just heading for the same results as before. So the only real story is that the right wing is shifting from the Conservatives to Reform, and this is something interesting because, again, the last time this happened was the last time a nationwide election was won by such a wide party that wasn't one of the two big ones was the 2014 European Parliament election, which is kind of funny that we elected MPs to the European Parliament, or MEPs. We elected MPs to the European Parliament, and what's interesting about it is as we elected these people, we elected most of them under the banner of please don't, we don't like the EU, we want to send people there that also don't like the EU, and so UKIP, the UK Independence Party, it's Nigel Farage's old party, 2 parties ago now, he's got a long history of running populist right-wing parties, you could argue. But what's interesting is, Nigel Farage did such a good job here that he forced the Conservatives' hands that they couldn't just pretend the EU issue didn't exist. They couldn't just say, look, we'll leave that to the side. Instead, the Conservative Party had to basically absorb the UKIP vote. This is something even more intensified by the 2015 UK election. Hopefully, there we go. The UK election, basically, the UKIP party was running on this huge anti-EU thing, and the only way that the Conservatives could hope to gobble up some of their votes, and they still didn't get that much of them, by the way, was to say, look, we will hold an EU referendum, and so the biggest policy from UKIP indirectly via this election, and then via the, you might be familiar with that vote. What is that? 2016 UK referendum. I'm sure there was a bunch of them that year. But then we had a referendum, basically because of the internal politics, and that led to more or less UKIP getting their founding goal. And then UKIP went away for a few years and then came back as the Brexit Party. And then the Brexit Party got renamed to Reform. And so the argument, if you are a right-wing party, either you are going to replace the Conservatives, like they looked like they might have been doing in 2014. Either you replace the Conservatives eventually and then you get to dictate what it is that is conservatism, or the Conservative Party has to, absorb some of your policies. In the same way that if the Labour Party was doing really successfully and the Green Party started taking over them, or the Lib Dems or the SNP or whatever, the Labour Party would have to start adopting some of their policy positions. The same has been happening with the right of the UK for some time. There's kind of two very different, if I can draw England very poorly here, let's do it. So I would say that this is something I've been mentioning for a while, but if we look at the UK, as I've drawn beautifully right here, this is Wales, that's Scotland up there. I'm sorry, Scotland, you look like a very inappropriate... I'll draw some islands to make this look better. There we go. So this is, I would say that across the UK, there is a slightly different breed of left-wing based on where you are. I think particularly if you are in Scotland, you're a bit more of a left Labour, let's say. So we'll draw that in like hard red, just to be simple. And I also think if you live in London, you're a bit more of a hard left Labour person. It's in different ways entirely, but if we simplify that down, whereas the rest of the country is kind of under this same vibe of at least can vote for the same party or the same leader off the Labour Party, right? So Labour is by and large the same party everywhere, except maybe those two places. Some would argue also not in Bristol or Brighton or whatever else, but generally speaking, that's how you put it, right? Whereas the right wing has a much harder problem because instead of being, the Labour Party has to deal with, two places that are much to the left of them and some places which are much to the right of them. Instead, the Conservative Party are like, well, if you're in Scotland, what it means to conserve is very different to what it means to conserve if you are in the north of England. Conservative in London, for example, is hugely different to conservative in the southwest, where it's more rural interests. I think right-wing parties, broadly speaking, always have this challenge, which is one of the reasons why, if I can talk about something I'm very excited about, the 2025 Australian election. Are you familiar with the fact that they're called, the second place party, the people trying to win it, what people are calling Timu Trump, I think is the fun term against them. But if you look at it, the Labour Party is one party in Australia, and then it has to be the Liberal National Coalition, because the people who run in this seat, this giant one here, have to be different to the people who run in the slightly conservative parts of the city. And that happens in the UK to such a wide level that we have a Conservative Party that has to balance the interests of like rural farming in the southwest and the interests of conservatism in Scotland, which has a huge unionism element to it. And then the interests of conservatism in kind of downtrodden areas is going to be different to those in rich areas. There is such a huge fracture in the Conservative Party that has been played into perfectly by the Reform Party, who will just simply say have really captured the hearts and minds of everyone in like the north of, I would say broadly speaking, the north of England, as well as, if I'm being totally honest, like in like the south of England, in some parts, I would say largely minority-driven parts, but in parts of the south of England, there is a similar thing there too. And so the Reform Party gets to be here, hoovering up those votes from the Conservatives, and so the Conservatives have to adopt positions that are to the right, or at least to the different end of the rest of their party, and this represents some real problems. But I think the simplest thing here is like, well, if in 2015 the solution was, okay, we'll become, if not tacitly anti-EU, because we'd lose votes from that, we'll become pro-EU referendum, what do you do about the Reform Party taking over if you are either the Conservatives or the Labour? Keep in mind, bear in mind, for the Labour Party, this is still bad. They went from 52% of the vote to 38. They went from 22,000 votes to 12,000. The Labour Party are losing to the Reform Party too, which is a sign that this populism isn't just working on the Conservatives anymore. It largely is, maybe 2/3 is, but a lot of Labour voters are shifting there too. And so Labour, for the first time, instead of being, again, more or less split, the Labour Party has to worry about the populist right and what they can take from it. And so what is the clear thing? I think that there is no question that the one thing, the way that you could, maybe even Nigel Farage would be happy with this, but the way that you could make reform voters shift back to you, the equivalent of having an EU referendum, is dealing with what many might describe as long-term migration being quite high. In fact, if you look at this chart, this goes from 1964 to the present, you can see that we had a real issue in the 60s, 70s, and the early 80s with net migration being negative. Too many people were leaving for places like, funnily enough, Australia. I bet we could trace at least one of these guys to this net immigration wave. People were leaving the UK, and people didn't believe their prospects were good, which is a bummer. And how do we solve that? Not by getting fewer people to leave. In fact, more people leave every year now, but by getting more people to join and replace them. This was a decent enough thing, and it worked in the 80s. So we went from having a net emigration, a net population loss, to having a net migration gain. So the population started going up. Things were looking great. All the markets were booming, housing, stocks, everything else, because the UK was on the up and up, and we kind of just concluded, oh, the more we increase our population, the more our economy does well, and GDP and all those things. And so during the 90s and early 2000s, particularly with the EU expansion, we started letting more and more people in, and once we got to the point where 250,000 people a year were coming into the country, that's when people started to vote for kind of more right-wing parties. If you don't remember, I kind of want to make a whole video about immigration, but I remember in 2010, the British National Party, they do describe themselves as this. They're one of the few people who actually, most of the time this term has no meaning because people will, use it just as an insult. But we had a literal party like that were doing pretty well, at least, relative to the idea of running as that. But they kind of declined as the rise of UKIP came up, and they declined after 2010 because the Conservatives brought, what you could argue is we kind of had this little anti-immigration became at least a stated policy. The Conservatives said it would come down to tens of thousands a year, but instead of going down to tens of thousands, from 250,000, it went up to 300 million, and then it went up again to that is net what is that, net 270 million. And then just after COVID, because it had gone down a little bit, what people call the Boris wave came in, where it went up to a net migration of almost 1 million people a year. Again, people were upset. There was discontent. People were voting for a openly what do we want to call this party, an openly Fredo supporting party. There we go, that's the simplest British way to put it. But people were getting really upset at this number, and then we decided to triple and then quadruple that number. And so this is something that I think is very simply dealable with. You just have to bring the... I think, in fact, I don't think there's anyone who can argue this number should go up or stay the same. I think even the most, pro-immigration person would say, yeah, at the point where every year 2% of your population is a person who has just arrived that year. If you think about it this way, since 2022, 6% of the UK population has arrived. There is over a 1 in 20 chance that if you are living in the UK right now, you arrived for the first time in the last 3 years. That is a shocking figure. And so it does have all sorts of issues, whether believed or not. And it means that if you look at the Lincolnshire mayor, one of the things that, people supported her on is because she thinks that all of the illegal immigrants that are coming in should be housed in tents like they are in France, which should be good enough for us here in Britain. And people are like, yeah, actually, if taxes are, again, if we go back to this original article, one of the big analysis of this is the idea that, people are fed up with high taxes and illegal immigration, and they've started to link the two. Taxes are at what feels like an all-time high because of fiscal drag. Taxes are what feel like an all-time high for most people born right now. Obviously, if you've been alive since the 80s, it's not. But if you've been alive since the 80s, then we're actually you're probably getting a state pension, and so actually not that way. For any taxpayer who's been alive right now, taxes are the highest they've ever been, and you see that, and then you hear about some story about migrant hotels and the fact that we spend like 10 billion a year on them or whatever, and you're like, oh, so our taxes go up so we can support this large number of people. I think that whether this is a rightly believed stance or not, each of the major parties, I think that for the Conservatives, this is hard because they're out of power, but the Labour Party could easily neuter could easily take the bark out of the bite, Is that the phrase? The bite out of the bark? They could easily, like neuter the response by just saying, look, yeah, obviously a lot of left-leaning people don't like this, but a lot of left-leaning people like having a functioning welfare state and like having a functioning system, and the only, I think that is something that therefore should be worked on. You can see it's coming down now. How much should it come down? What should the end total be? Should net migration sit at 700 million people a year? Well, that's a complicated question with a complicated answer. But for now, I do think that I think that as a party, both of the major, I think that both the Conservatives and the Labour Party should be thinking, what are our actual policies? Should it be something along the lines of not just, okay, definitely deal with illegal immigration, right? But what about, like, should we cut the legal immigration routes? And how do we do that in the best way? How do we cut not the doctors and the, the high-paid accountants coming over here? How do we stop the, I don't know, the Deliveroo riders who are then eventually going to become a net drain anyway? How do we make a more functional society? Even if not for the sake of having a functional society, how do we make a society that voters think is functional should be the priority for both the Labour and the Conservative Party, and how that will go is entirely down to how the Labour Party responds with their actual policies and how the Conservative Party responds with their, much easier stated policies, I guess you could say, because otherwise we'll have Greg's workers winning elections in the UK. That's kind of a fun fact. But otherwise, that's what will happen instead. And yeah, it's a very interesting situation in the UK. And yeah, hopefully, so look at that. Literally, this happened while I was recording this video. Starmer says by-election loss to reform is disappointing and vows further and faster change. That is the move, right? Even if it is literally take the low-hanging fruit of like, oh, there are people here illegally because they overstayed a visa. What if we went and made them not here illegally? Or I think that actually, I think there are loads of easy wins. There are some really bold stances that reform will eventually push into the mainstream. Like, what if we make it impossible to get citizenship if you weren't born here? Or make the time period like 20 years? I think it's like 5 years right now. I think these policies will become mainstream unless you as a major party can do it. And so that's the interesting thing in politics, right? Even if you don't like something, if your biggest opposition who are winning everywhere say they're going to, you either do the thing in a milder, fits with your policies way, or they eventually get elected and they get to do it. And I think that's, regardless of what you think about reform policies, that is how politics works. If the Green Party were the biggest party, if they had 50% of the vote, even if every other party went, no, but we need, I don't know, what are the Green Party actually against? They're not actually a Green Party, but like, let's just say that a Green Party that were running on a full environmental platform level, even if you were in love with oil as Keir Starmer, even if as the Conservatives you're like, but I love natural gas, you would have to implement their policies, or they would come in and implement those policies themselves. This is how politics works. This is the nature of the game, and if we have two big parties, I think at least one of them needs to actually come down on it. And I don't think people are going to trust the Conservatives, and so it's either the Labour Party or it's the Reform Party. And who will it be? We'll find out in 2029, I guess. Anyway, with that said, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Should we dive deeper into immigration sometime and the interesting relationship the Western world has with it? I don't know. For now, though, I do know that on tomorrow, oh yeah, literally, so like Sunday morning, we should know what's happening in the Australian federal election. I'm excited. It's a real close one, Is it going to be another win for the Labour Party, or are the Liberal National Coalition going to get it? How's it going for the Green Party over there? Or the Katters Australian Party, which is hilarious, by the way. Just an exact example of the point that the right-wing vote, even when they split into, national and liberal and, kind of rural versus not, you still manage to get a rural interest party and then a centre alliance party. Anyway, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed. Have a great day, because I'll see you in the next one. Okay. Second channel, don't care. Bye.